Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. My name is Jack Baker, and welcome to the penultimate episode of The Plight of the Pangolin. On the last show, we talked a little bit about trafficking and the huge impact it has on the pangolin. On today's show, we're going to be talking about an issue heavily intertwined with trafficking, that being COVID-19, or coronavirus. Later in the show, we will be talking to Professor Jo Sharp about her work surrounding zoonosis and contextualised working. However, before we get there, we should review the coronavirus and pangolin storyline and look at its positive and negative impacts. As the pangolin carries forms of coronavirus, when the COVID-19 pandemic began, specimens found at the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan were cited as being a potential source of zoonotic transmission. Zoonotic transmission is the transfer of disease from animals to humans. This can occur directly through transmission via air or bites, think influenza or rabies, or through an intermediary species which picks up the disease, does not get sick, but then transfers it onto humans through one of the methods mentioned before, bites or airborne transmission. In the coronavirus story, it is thought that the pangolin was an intermediary species between bats and humans. Despite this being deemed highly unlikely, this has cast a controversial light on the pangolin. Every interviewee we've spoken to so far mentioned that the pandemic had affected their work, halting investigations into trafficking, preventing community engagement, shutting down zoos and similar organisations, and introducing new uncertainties, like a potential increase in poaching for the bushmeat trade. However, it would be wrong to see this as exclusively a bad thing for pangolin. It was because of the species linked to COVID-19 that on the 24th of February 2020, China, a major consumer of pangolin products, announced that its top legislative committee had voted to suspend the buying, selling, transporting, and eating of wildlife indefinitely until the laws were reviewed. On the 5th of June 2020, the Chinese National Forestry and Grassland Administration announced that under their wildlife protection law, pangolin would be upgraded from a Class 2 to a Class 1 animal, heightening protections and making the punishments for harming these animals more severe. Following this, on June 9th, it was reported that the government approved traditional Chinese medicine pharmacopoeia removed pangolin scales from their 2020 edition. While originally considered a major development, especially given trafficking's link to this trade, on the 23rd of June, the Environmental Investigation Agency obtained a copy of this document and discovered apparent loopholes. Through a comparative analysis with the 2010 and 2015 editions, it was shown that while pangolins had been removed from the list of key ingredients, 8 patented medicine formula still listed the scales as an ingredient. The Environmental Investigation Agency have therefore stated that while they applaud the effort of those in China campaigning for the changing of regulation, this must go further. Simultaneously, the Vietnamese government has been advancing pangolin protections, first agreeing a new trade deal with the EU which would hopefully limit the trade of illegal wildlife, before on the 24th of July announcing a total ban on the wildlife trade in response to COVID-19 and the risks associated with it. So these narratives are very complicated. They are most certainly still developing. However, while this may be the case, it doesn't mean that we should call them bad, because as we can see, there's been law change, and it also doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about potential solutions or developments that we can make going forward. For this reason, I sat down with Professor Jo Sharp to talk about her work in the area of zoonotic transmission. Of particular relevance are her critiques of the One Health initiative, which is actually being proposed by some organisations, such as the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, as a solution to the pandemic. So, really look forward to listening to that. Anyway, please enjoy my discussion with Professor Jo Sharp. Hello everyone, welcome back to the show. I am now joined by Professor Jo Sharp, currently working as part of an interdisciplinary team of epidemiologists, vets, modelers and social scientists. She's helping to evaluate the key drivers of zoonotic disease in northern Tanzania
understand the impacts of these diseases, and develop interventions that will be appropriate for the various affected communities. So first of all, welcome to the show, Joe. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for the invitation.
First of all, that sounds like an incredibly diverse working environment. What made you want to get into an interdisciplinary team?
I think my background as a geographer leads me to embrace interdisciplinarity. I think we like to think of ourselves as the kind of original interdisciplinary discipline. Our training as undergraduates covers an understanding of the physical processes that shape the world around us, and importantly, how those interact with the kind of things I'm particularly interested in is our social processes and people's understandings of the world around them. And there's a lot of problems that we face in the world, a lot of questions that really can only be understood by bringing disciplines together. And I'm incredibly encouraged that there seems to be quite a move towards interdisciplinarity in dealing with some of these wicked problems, as they're often referred to, that we can't just see as being a purely economic issue or a purely environmental issue, but that we have to understand how different aspects of the story come together and interact with one another.
That's really interesting, actually. I really, really like the idea of bringing all of these kind of stakeholders to the table. And I was wondering, from your perspective, what the benefits of having the critical social scientist perspective there as part of that discussion.
Well, obviously, as the critical social scientist on the project, I see that as being absolutely key. But I think, so if I can take a step back, the approach that we're adopting to understand zoonoses, the patterns of disease transfer from animals to people in northern Tanzania, is broadly called One Health. And that's an approach that has become increasingly influential in global health in the last few years. And One Health recognizes that we can't understand or make interventions in human health without understanding its interactions and links to animal health and to the kind of broader health of the environment. Now, to a geographer such as myself, that's starkly obvious that we need to bring these things together. But the traditions, particularly of medicine and veterinary science, have operated almost independently. So to bring those together has been apparently quite revolutionary. But I think the need for critical social sciences is really important, because one of the things that has been done by bringing those together is the social science element of it has often been expected to be quite descriptive. So that we're looking at describing patterns of human infection, describing patterns of who's vulnerable as a result of employment or where they live or gender or something like that. And one of the things that leads to is quite an individualizing approach to health-seeking behavior. There's a sense that in some of the models of health-seeking behavior, that people give people the right information, give them the right education, and they will behave properly. So there's a sense that there is a way to behave. It's a very kind of biomedical, very kind of often implicitly westernized sense of what is good behavior. And of course, what that does is it completely ignores some of the structural conditions that may be shaping people's ability to behave in particular ways. And so as a critical social scientist, I want to bring an understanding of the impacts of patriarchy, the impacts of capitalism, the impacts of processes that are beyond individuals' ability to kind of be educated and therefore behave in different ways. So I think there's a bit of a joke that my role is always to sort of stand up at the end of the meeting and go, but it's more complicated than that. But I think we are finding ways of not just adding complication, but finding ways to make more appropriate and reasonable sorts of interventions that don't expect behaviour that simply is not possible in particular contexts.
I like that. I think coming from a background in international relations, I've experienced similar things where I'm talking to people. Maybe it's one of my computer scientist friends or somebody who does biology, and they present, this is the answer, this is the thing that we're going to do. And then it falls on social scientists sometimes like, oh, but have you thought of what might happen a little bit down the line?
Exactly. I mean, when we started, I remember the very, very first meeting I was invited to, and we were planning actually a project that didn't get funded. And I just remember the person, in fact, it was the medic who started this whole research off. And he just turned to me and said, right, Joe, you're the social scientist, you'll do the household surveys. And I said, no, I don't do household surveys. You know, I know that there's a place for them, and epidemiologists love them because you can get big numbers, you can model them, you can have degrees of certainty, you can look at cause and effect. But a survey is only good as the questions you ask. And thankfully, the team I've been working with, although they had their perceptions of what I would do in the same way as I had kind of probably stereotypical perceptions of what each of them would contribute, have been really responsive to my critical interventions. It's great. We have developed a kind of system of trust. And quite early on, thankfully, we had a very clear example of the benefits of using a more interpretive, qualitative social science approach. So the zoonotic diseases that we've been considering are often thought to be transmitted through the consumption of unpasteurized animal products like milk. And so one of the household questionnaire questions was, do you boil your milk before consumption? Almost everyone said yes. And we were really surprised at this, because that suggested that there shouldn't be any contamination through milk. And yet that was one of our hypotheses, was that was one of the main routes of transmission. And there's a real sense in kind of public health in that area that we need to be encouraging people to pasteurize or boil the milk. So in the focus groups, we said, so you boil your milk before you consume it? Yes, and they were able to explain why. They said there are these wadudu, which mean little creatures in the milk, and boiling kills them. So, okay, so we said, so even if you consume mtindi, which is kind of a soured milk, kind of a yogurt, you would still boil it? And they said, mtindi? No, you wouldn't boil that. Why would you boil that? That's no, it will ruin the taste. It won't set properly. So for me, I was thinking this was the same product, because basically you had fresh milk from the cow consumed. They weren't lying in their response to the household survey, because if they were going to consume that fresh milk, which they would do generally as in a cup of tea, they would boil it. But 90% of their consumption of milk was this thing called mtindi, which is basic, and it's not even a culture that's put in. It's just milk that's been sat during the day in a plastic container that sours and goes lumpy, and that's then used a day or two later, and it's put into porridge and it's eaten as a dish that way. And whereas I assumed, and all of the sort of Western scientists assumed, it was the same product because it's the same thing that's just been sat there. Locally, it was considered to be something completely different and treated completely different. And what was absolutely fascinating to me was that of all the people we spoke to, and remember, almost everyone we spoke to said, oh yes, you boil the milk because there are these little creatures. When we shifted to talking about the soured milk, not only did they not boil it, but only, I think, 2 people even offered a reason that they wouldn't do it. Everyone else was just, well, of course you wouldn't. And only 2, I mean, one person said it had been out of the cow long enough so the little creatures would have died. They just can't survive very long. And one person said that the thing that I thought was the obvious thing is that, that the souring, the kind of acid, would kill them. The rest didn't even think that there was a reason to explain. So that got at not just the kind of superficial behavior, but started to explain what was going on. And that was so important in terms of the emerging process of interdisciplinary working, that we began to understand what different parts of the interdisciplinary team could contribute to the whole. And I think one of the things that I'm always banging on about is interdisciplinarity is not about somehow bringing all the different bits of the answer together so that we get closer to the truth. But I think where the most interesting aspects of interdisciplinarity are is when 2 different approaches gives you quite different answers, because that's then suggesting, oh, there's something interesting going on there that we need to explore further. So it's not as this really smooth, coherent, everything comes together towards one end, but it's kind of some of the jags and the interactions and the tensions between different bits that I think starts to raise really interesting questions about what's going on. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your very straightforward question.
I like that answer, and I really like that example, how you saw success very quickly in the necessity of the working together very, very quickly. I was wondering, since one of those first successes, what are some of your proudest achievements, almost, of this wouldn't have happened if we didn't have an interdisciplinary group of people working together?
Ooh, that's a very good question. Well, I mean, I think we do have a better understanding of how different bits of processes interact together. And I'm obviously, the examples I'm going to keep giving are make it sound like qualitative social science is providing all the answers, and I really don't mean that, because there's certain points where what we've been asking is hugely informed by the kind of patterns that the modelers are finding in terms of the household survey, or in terms of the serological material that we've got in terms of patterns of infection. And one thing that we're working on just now is a paper that looks at how these things come together. And I think it's only seeing how they all come together that we have a story, and it's a story that can't be as I said, it's a story that can't be disentangled and told from a sort of separate disciplinary perspective. So I'm really proud of the fact that we have been able to communicate with each other. I think there's a sense that interdisciplinarity, because it's fashionable, is dead easy, and you can just put lots of different people in a room together and they'll work well together. That's rubbish. It takes a lot of time to develop trust in each other, to be confident that you can. Everyone's not trying to do everything. We're not having a kind of lowest common denominator approach. We each have to be trusted that what we bring to the table is our expertise. And I think that takes a long time, and it has taken years that we're able to work together and communicate. But I think the thing that's kind of most exciting about this project in some way is something that emerged that we weren't anticipating. And because we had this fairly broad approach, we were able to be receptive to this. So we went in to this most recent project looking at the drivers of change, thinking that we knew what the key zoonotic diseases were, because we'd done a project before, we'd spoken to people, we got a sense of the diseases, but we were asking about particular things in a very focused way, using some of the methods, but there was still the opportunity in focus groups for people to talk about what mattered to them. And it soon emerged that there was a disease which may or may not be zoonotic. We don't know it. We know it has the potential to transmit to humans, but at the moment we don't think it does. And it all emerged because people started telling us about their dizzy goats, which was not something we'd thought about. And we were told, oh yeah, the goats, they just go zunguka, they go round and round in circles and they die. And what it turns out that this is it's a coeneurosis, it's called, and it's a cyst that goats get on their brains. And it affects their motor control and is ultimately fatal. And this was something that was really concerning the pastoralists we were working with, because people didn't really seem to know about the disease, and they would go and speak to vet officers and they didn't really know about the disease. It's not seen as a priority by the Tanzanian government, and yet this was the main priority for the pastoralists. And what was happening was that the goats would die, they would still be eaten by the community, their brains would be left for the dogs would eat the brain, end up swallowing the parasite, would defecate the parasite elsewhere, and would basically keep the cycle going. And so what we're now doing as a follow-on project is trying to develop a participatory epidemiology, where we have the concerns and experiences of the people we're working with absolutely front and center. Because they are really concerned about this disease, we can talk about questions around zoonoses and transmission between species, and think about ways of controlling that transmission in a way that will directly impact their dizzy goats and help the dizzy goats, but allows for a broadening of discussion into a wider sense of human and animal health. And of course, every study that you'll ever see points out that if people are really motivated, if this is something they see as important, they're way more likely to comply with good practice and for it to be sustainable. And so I'm proud that we've that through this process, we've identified with the communities something that is of absolute importance to them, and that hopefully we can really make a difference. We're talking about small numbers of people, but that working with them, that's where we can help to make a difference.
That's fascinating, actually. The theories that I always liked when I was studying international relations were the ones that kind of involved more getting down to that base level, dealing with it with the people that are the main concern, the people involved. We touched on the One Health concept a little bit in one of your responses a second ago. And before this interview, I was reading over some of your papers, and in Rethinking One Health, Emergent Human, Animal and Environmental Assemblages, you challenge the idea of One Health in a way because you put forward that it's been taken over by Western ideas and might not be the best method for getting to these base levels which your interdisciplinary approach is getting to. I wondered if you could explain to the listeners why you think that.
Very impressed that you've read that. It's only just come out. So, well done on your homework. That's this is, it's in a sense, I'm kind of building on work that I've done before. If I can, this is not going to be a short answer, I apologize. But before I worked in Tanzania, I worked in southern Egypt with Bedouin populations. And one of the things that I was very keen to think about, because the project broadly was about this protected area in southeast Egypt. It was botanists, soil scientists, and so forth were fascinated, chemists were fascinated by this particular landscape, and didn't really think too much about the fact there were people as part of this landscape. They were seeing it as a natural landscape. And so a colleague and I got involved with that project to make sure that the understandings of Bedouin people themselves were drawn into any account of this area, that they weren't kind of somehow written out of this area. And so we engaged with the concept of Indigenous knowledge, which suddenly became very fashionable. And even the World Bank had an Indigenous knowledge page, and it was all about if you can just add Indigenous knowledge to development, you're going to get better outcomes. And the problem with that was that their understanding of Indigenous knowledge was incredibly superficial. That Indigenous knowledge was like, an understanding of medicinal plants or a perception of particular resources that could be kind of sprinkled onto development as normal, just to give it luster, to make it look, a little bit ethnic and kind of cool. Indigenous knowledges weren't allowed to have a deeper epistemology, a deeper sense of understanding of the world that might not simply be added to a World Bank development model, but might actually subvert it, might challenge it. And so at that point, we wrote a piece quite a long time ago, trying to think much more critically about what Indigenous knowledge might do if we thought about it in a post-colonial sense, if we brought it into engagement with some of the concepts of voice and concepts of alternative epistemologies and so forth. And it occurred to me when I first came across the concept of One Health, that the same thing was happening, that we had, and I don't know if you've seen in the paper, and for anyone listening who's not had the delight of looking at that paper, if you Google One Health, it's usually explained in terms of diagrams, and is most commonly 3 intersecting circles. One that's human health, one that's animal health, one that's the environment. And these, right in the middle of where all these things intersect, is the concept of One Health. And on the surface, and this is why I kind of went back to Egypt, because I think the kind of conceptually it's the same sort of thing. On the surface, it makes One Health look incredibly interdisciplinary, entangled, integrative, and so forth. But one of the things that, when I was looking at those circles, I was looking at those diagrams, it really reminded me of the diagrams in Bruno Latour's book, We Have Never Been Modern, if you've come across that. He's a theorist, he's a science and technology studies sort of theorist, actor network theory. And the very act of showing an integration of these 3 circles suggests or implies that these circles can somehow be separate, that we can somehow separate humans from the environment, from animals, that we are, and that's the great, what Latour would talk about, is a kind of great myth of modernity, that somehow we are modern, we are separate from nature. All the Western Enlightenment binaries of culture versus nature, mind versus body, all these sorts of things that somehow privileges people and suggests that we are separate. And of course, one of the things that has characterized human geography recently, and many other social sciences, is a turn towards posthumanism, a turn towards recognizing the it's not agency, because it's not usually agency, because that suggests a degree of intentionality, but certainly recognizes other things as having influence there, as actants in the way that the world works, that it's not just all about what we do, but there are agents, there is agency anyway in terms of environment and animals. And of course, as soon as you move away from Western Enlightenment thought, the concept that somehow you can separate humans from animals or humans from the environment from which we come, it becomes deeply problematic, that there's sort of spiritual links, that there's sense of kinship between humans and other animals, that what Jane Bennett would talk about as a much more vitalist world, where there's vitality, there's life in other things other than humans. And so it seemed that just as I didn't want to get rid of the concept of Indigenous knowledges all those years ago back in Egypt, it seemed I didn't want to get rid of One Health. I think it's a really powerful way of working. I think bringing different, as I said a few minutes ago, bringing together these different perspectives is really important. But it seemed that the One Health approach, the way that it's ordinarily conceived of, limits you before you even start, and it inherently reproduces a kind of Western way of thinking about the relationships between humans and animals. And in saying this, we were very much influenced by the work of Steve Hinchliffe, who, along with Susan Craddock, edited a special issue of Social Science and Medicine, about 10 years ago, starting to sort of challenge. They were particularly critical of a kind of implicit Western centrism being reproduced through One Health. They talked about One Health, one version of One Health that first emerged, which was One World, One Health, which suggested a kind of consistency of understanding of what health is and what, the decisions that need to be made in terms of those intersections between humans and animals. And what they were arguing, of course, is that there are many worlds, there's many different concepts of health, and the way that we in the West might decide to make an intervention, usually based around the demands of capitalism or the demands of of the state or something like that, may be a very different sort of intervention that would be made in a context where these circles were not seen as quite so readily separable.
Okay, yeah. I don't know. I kind of like the idea of this simplified model because I think it can be good to simplify things in a way sometimes to sell them to people. But if you allow yourself to become so reliant on the simplified model or overly sell the simplified model, then there's another danger there that it just becomes overly simplified in its entirety.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I'm very happy to be strategic, and depending on what space I'm in, what institution I'm in, who I'm talking to, I will switch between that simplified model and the more complex model. There's multiple discussions to be had. As I said, there's a lot of medics who are still quite resistant to the concept of One Health. There's one author who basically dismissed One Health as a land grab by the vets because it was seen as so linked to veterinary science. There's all sorts of things going on. So there are occasions where just getting the simplified model accepted is quite a challenge, and another context where we need to be chipping away at exactly what we mean by that context.
Would you say that's kind of the biggest challenge you've run up against in dealing with the One Health concept?
I think I've been really lucky, as I said before, that the team that I'm involved with, which is led primarily by Sarah Cleveland, who's a vet epidemiologist at Glasgow and a really remarkable scientist who's had a long commitment to working in East Africa and just has so much enthusiasm for engaging with different ideas, that there are occasions where I run up against, oh, but this is how we've always done it, but it's not done in an exclusionary way. I've heard other people in other projects who've not been so lucky. So I do consider myself very lucky. We're now at the stage that we're writing things, and this is becoming much more of a challenge because, of course, editorships of journals and reviewers may not always be so willing to think broadly, and we have had challenges. We wrote something for a journal a few years ago which claimed, I'm not going to say which one it is, which claimed to be an interdisciplinary kind of global health journal, and it had our paper had a little bit of social science at the end. I mean, it really wasn't a major part. It wasn't anything particularly interpretive, and we struggled so much because we were not doing social science the way that they thought we should, and they pointed us towards the National Institute of Health in America, their page about how to integrate disciplines, and it wasn't interdisciplinarity. It was basically, we are biomedical scientists, and this is how you kind of basically squish social science into the way of doing it as usual. And their model for how to do social science was really problematic because it was basically saying you have to do it the way that we would do it. That's not interdisciplinarity. I think that's tokenism. So we have struggled on occasion, but I think the longer that a lot of the UK research councils are funding more and more interdisciplinary projects. Now, the cynics amongst us say that's because they have less and less money, and if they all chip in a bit of money to one particular scheme, they can all claim that they funded it, and that makes it look like they're doing more. Maybe so. But what's great about this is the different research councils tend to host different projects. And so that is forcing work to be done differently to be able to be funded by them. The one disappointing thing is that the Economic and Social Research Council, that the research council that funds social science work, has much less money than the Medical Research Council and the BBSRC, which is the Biotech and Biological Research Council. So when they come together to fund these interdisciplinary things, they're always a kind of junior partner. And so one of the things, I've been involved in a number of research applications. I've been involved in a number of evaluation panels for the research councils. And although social scientists are getting, critical social science is becoming more common, I've yet to see a big interdisciplinary project led by social science, or certainly one that's been funded. I've yet not to see that. And for the project that we finished a couple of years ago, looking at the drivers of change, which was a £3.5 million project, so it was a big project. Sarah, the vet epidemiologist, and I decided, in order to make it clear to the funders how important we saw genuine collaboration, we tried to put ourselves forward as co-PIs, so co-principal investigators, to say the vet's epidemiology side and the social science side are of equal importance. And it's impossible. None of the infrastructure for applying for a grant, for being registered as the lead person, is possible. So there always has to be one person, and that one was being coordinated by the Biotech Biological Research Council. So ultimately, it's become her project. So it's a struggle. And I think that's why we need that kind of, that we use the language of One Health strategically, but that we also write these kind of critical reflections on them as well, so that we need to get ourselves involved in these evaluation committees and on the grants and on the publications, so that we start to be taken seriously as contributors. But at the same time, we need to be kind of pushing the research agenda as well by saying, okay, this is all good stuff. Really glad to be involved with this. But what if we were to do this as well? And it'll change over time. It's changing slowly, but...
That's, again, very interesting to me, because I think the prospects and the advantages of interdisciplinary study are numerous, but sometimes there's a lack of reflection upon what the challenges were. So I think hearing you say that has actually been very helpful for me, especially now in the kind of interdisciplinary space that I'm working in. I think what I would like to ask now is that we kind of talked about the challenges you faced working with the Western ideas and that side. I wondered if there was ever a point where you felt traditional ideas should be perhaps challenged, because the example that immediately springs to my mind studying pangolins is that very recently they were removed from the list of ingredients that are allowed in traditional Chinese medicine, even though we've known for a long time that scientifically they don't really have much effect on anything. So I was wondering, from your experiences, is there ever a point where you would think, oh, we maybe should challenge the traditional idea, or would you always just leave the tradition as it is?
I think that's the big question, isn't it? And that's why, you're going back to the work in Egypt, that's why we wanted to engage with the concept of indigenous knowledge, because what I should have said when I was talking about that is, on the one hand, you have the kind of World Bank approach that indigenous knowledge is something superficial that you just sprinkle over the top. At the same time, and this was back in the late 90s, early 2000s, you had the anti-development folks like Escobar basically saying that Western development, Western science, etc., was discredited, and that we need to celebrate alternatives. And I didn't feel at all comfortable with that, because there are all sorts of things that, as you point out, are problematic. And I think this is a huge challenge, and I ultimately don't have an answer for you. And I think that it's where co-production of research is important. The reason I think it's important is because I don't want to get rid of Western science. I'm very, very happy. I live at a time that we have these scientific discoveries, and the idea that somehow, oh well, we're going to have complete relativism, I'm going to essentially deprive you of some of the insights of Western development, because that's not your culture. Your culture is different, and I think that's really problematic. And as my colleague, the guy I worked with in Egypt, a guy called John Briggs, was very fond of saying, the Bedouin men that he spoke with had a real sense of commitment to their way of life. But if you came along with a better way of doing something, they weren't going to say, oh, well, that's not my indigenous knowledge, I'm not going to do it. Indigenous knowledge is not this thing preserved in aspect, unchanging and inflexible. It's something that responds to the world around it. It's modern, it's vibrant, but it's different. And I think how we then make those decisions, how we then say, well, what is the right course of action? I think that very question is really troubling, because it asks the question as to, well, who's the we in this particular case? And I think what we've been trying to do to walk that tightrope between abandoning people to relativism, or in that kind of very paternalistic Western centric way saying this is what's right, is to have discussions with people where we can present what we know and they can present what they know. And I don't think we're in a position to say that they're wrong. Mm-hmm. We can only tell them what we found out and explain to them what we found out, and then work with them to decide what is best in the context of their lives. I don't think we can come in to their communities and say what you're doing is wrong. We can present our evidence and then leave it to them to decide. And I'm not sure how helpful this is an example, but it's the one that I think that kind of that I keep coming back to. Again, in the Egypt work, we made a terrible mistake, but it was one of the most revealing things we've ever done. So we were working with these Bedouin population. It wasn't a One Health project as such, but it did involve the health of their animals. And traditionally, Bedouin had been very mobile. They would cover huge areas with their flocks of sheep, looking for grazing, because in the desert, grazing will come up and will get burnt off by the sun very quickly. So they had to be super mobile to do that. But then in the 1960s, we had the establishment of the high dam, the Aswan Dam, which the damming of the Nile is in the wrong place. If you're going to dam the Nile, you really want to do it as is actually happening at the moment in the highlands of Ethiopia, where you've got nice deep channels. The desert of Egypt is hydrologically speaking not a great place for dam, but of course it's all about geopolitics. So you've got this huge lake. So suddenly you have this resource. So what has happened is that the women tend to be much more sedentary. So they'll stay close to the lake, and because it's so shallow, they still have to move a bit, because any meter difference in the height of the lake is about a kilometre and a half in terms of the shoreline moving back and forth. So there's a degree of movement, but they've become a lot more sedentary, and they get left with the old animals, the young animals, the sick animals, and some of the older population as well. So we were, going back to the forest chatting to them, and one of the things that they said to us was that their food security situation was really quite precarious, because they weren't moving around with the animals. And so we'd spoken to them about the possibility of developing gardens, because we were working with botanists. They came up with plants that could be grown. We provided a pump that could be shared so that they could irrigate from the water supply, and this was going to provide a bit of variety to their diet, a bit of fodder for their animals, some medicinal plants and herbs that they used and knew about. And many of the women were very reluctant, but 2 women just went for it. And I just thought, as a feminist, I thought, these women are, they're role models, they're spearheading all of this. And it was fantastic. We got these great pictures of these women in their gardens, farms or whatever. And I thought, this is brilliant. We have worked with them, we've produced this, it's great. We then went and spoke to the other women, and they said, we're not doing this. Bedouin don't do farming. And we discovered that they pitied the women who had got the gardens. Mm. And we then went and spoke to the 2 women who'd done it, and they were ashamed that they had to do it. And the reason that they'd done it is because they were both widows. So they did not have men who could take animals to the markets, because women weren't allowed to go to markets. So this was something that they did. We thought they were doing it, and it was empowering. They were doing it as an act of last resort. And that was such a crushing blow to what I thought I knew was happening. Mm-hmm. And such a wake-up call in terms of, don't you bring your Western concepts of empowerment and feminism with you. But what was really fascinating was that over the next couple of years, every single family developed a farm. And clearly what's happened is that women couldn't just go against their husbands and do something like this. Mm-hmm. But there was a negotiation, and this became a household activity. Women were closely associated with it, and I think in the long run, it did give them greater confidence. Mm-hmm. In all sorts of ways, but it had to be done on their terms, and they had to negotiate it so that it was something that they had chosen to do, rather than that they didn't have any choice. And Indigenous knowledge is, if there is one thing that unites them, is a sense of it not being theoretical, hypothetical, but being based on evidence and proof. They saw how effective these things were. They were able to bring their husbands and show them. And so it was that convinced them, rather than people like me coming along going, hey, wouldn't this be a great idea? And so that was such a wake-up call to me in terms of how we needed to work with folks to kind of get to that point, and not to assume that I know what's going on. And you said to me earlier, what was I most proud of? In fact, it's this project I'm most proud of. We had to stop working on it in the early 2000s, because after the attacks in America in 2001, it became increasingly difficult for us to get permits to go and work there from the Egyptian government. And then, of course, there's been all sorts of upheaval in Egypt since then. But Dr. Hoda Yaqub, who was working with us on the women's project, she started as a botanist, but then decided she was really interested in the women's work. And she has continued to work. She's now it was quite remarkable. She's now she's the regional director of the Egyptian Environmental Affairs Agency, which for a woman outside of Cairo is quite remarkable. And she has continued to work with Bedouin. The women, actually, even when I was still there, the women requested literacy classes. Now, that would never have happened before, but they came to us asking for that, which made the men very nervous. They worried that if the women could read, they would petition for divorce. So then the men wanted literacy. So had we gone in saying, this is what you're going to do, it wouldn't work. But because it was something that emerged from that kind of process of working together, of us not saying this is how you should do it, we learned our lesson from that with the farm,
Mm-hmm.
but saying here is a way you could do it. That was the way that over time trust was established. People were able to sort of think through the implications of adopting different activities, different ways of doing things, and we've been away from that project for 15 years, and it's still going on. It's still that the momentum has continued. So
that's incredibly inspiring. I think that I kind of like this idea of you can give people all the tools and you can leave it all there for them, and if they want to use them, they are then there. Keeping with the farming analogy, I guess it's almost like you can plant this seed and they can choose to come along and water it if they want to and make it grow, or they can leave it and move on to something else and focus on something else. So I like that idea a lot. I think shifting slightly into not a prediction, but more speculation, I wondered if then we've talked about how it's all about nurturing and kind of giving tools and allowing people to grow on their own. I wondered what your thoughts then were on the current health situation, which is obviously coronavirus. On a lot of Western media, Donald Trump springs particularly to mind, trying to almost villainize China and their practices. It seems to me to be very counterproductive in a lot of ways. I wondered what your thoughts were on this attempt to almost villainize people during the coronavirus pandemic.
I really don't think that it's helpful at all. And to be honest, with Trump, I think this is entirely, a kind of attempt to move back to a conventional isolationist geopolitics on the part of the US. I mean, he's turning his back on the WHO and all sorts of other things, and it's a way of changing the story so that the threat comes from outside, that the threat comes from over there and their dangerous exotic practices. And the same thing was done in terms of the Ebola outbreak. And there's been a lot of work done on what's called outbreak narratives, that we like to have a story that, this kind of obsession with patient zero and this obsession with where a practice happened that caused the first, spillover event from animal reservoirs to people. And, clearly there are behaviours in and around wet markets, in and around consumption of bushmeat that are risky. But on the other hand, these practices have been going on for a very long time. What makes us vulnerable now, of course, is the infrastructure of globalization and global capitalism. You can see that you look at all the wonderful animations that have come out about the spread of coronavirus, and it's a product of the Anthropocene. If you look at the kind of patterns it's taken, this is not your kind of traditional disease outbreak in the sense, to go back to Ebola. There's been, people suddenly were aware of Ebola. When was it? 2008, whatever it was, so 2015, in West Africa. Suddenly we all got panicky about it again. But there's been, it's been endemic in West Africa for decades. But the villages were not well connected, so Ebola burnt through the population that it could quickly and didn't spread very far. The problem is not that there isn't modernity in West Africa, but modernity is coming and making things more connected. And I think one of the things that, if I said to you right at the beginning that I'm trying to remain optimistic about things, I hope that one of the things that the kind of global imagination that coronavirus is giving us, if we put the president of the US to one side, recognizing that we have a shared vulnerability to this disease, is to understand the structural conditions of zoonotic spillover. And the UN has talked about this, and there's been a bit of coverage in the media. But yes, there are individual actions that we could villainize as in terms of sort of starting these spillover events. But what's much more important are structural changes that are happening. Climate change that's causing new interactions between species that we hadn't had before because of displacement of species. The rapid destruction of forests in different parts of the world, which has been driven by the global demand for coltan for our mobile phones, or other minerals, or increasing demand for animal protein with urbanization. That's cutting down forests and is bringing people into direct contact with animal reservoirs that previously had, quite happily, the diseases have have circulated within animal populations, very rarely jumping to humans because the contact was quite rare. We are creating the conditions for considerably more opportunities for spillover. It's not about, I mean, I do think, personally, I do think wet markets should probably be regulated better. I do think the bushmeat industry should be regulated better, but that's only part of the story. And I think the much bigger part of the story is the Anthropocene. Are the changes that capitalism and the system that we live in just now are driving at a much bigger scale beyond sort of this finger pointing at individuals that way. So I think it's really unhelpful. I think as I say, it's a naked attempt by Donald Trump to deflect attention away from his own mismanagement of the situation to return to kind of classic geopolitics, rather than a more collaborative approach that might have emerged as we realize that there is no such thing as a local disease anymore in this world. But
yeah, I think when I've been kind of thinking about this idea and talking with various people about it, I think starting to blame people and point the finger is a very dangerous game to get into, because, okay, we can point, it may have happened to jump from pangolin or a bat to a person in Wuhan, and then people will claim, oh, that's not natural, it's their fault. But then when you reflect upon it, how natural is it to pack chickens into small cages? How natural is it to put all of these cows or pigs into tiny, tiny little metal boxes to produce meat in a way that we would consider being from the West normal? So I think it can be a very dangerous game to start playing, and not an entirely productive one at that.
Although we don't have wet markets like that, one thing that, again, one of my vet friends pointed out was there's a huge market in exotic pets. And I didn't know this because I don't have a pet, but people do, the number of reptiles, for example, that get imported into Europe every year, and these are being bred elsewhere. We don't have those kind of controls over pets, but pets are seen as something nice and normal and unthreatening, unlike wet markets, which are, that I think we see wet markets through an entirely Orientalist lens, because they're so different from the kind of neatly packaged, sanitized, doesn't look like it's been anywhere near an animal sort of product that we have. So I think there's a sense that their practices are risky. I mean, I've been astonished as I've walked through the parks, particularly early on in lockdown, when we were all carefully walking 2 meters away from each other and that sort of thing, and seeing people kissing their dogs, in the same park. At that point, we had no idea whether COVID could be transmitted through domestic pets. And there's a real sense that somehow there's certain interactions that are dangerous and certain that are not. And I read a paper a couple of months ago that suggested that the kind of diseases that are likely to jump to humans might be more common amongst very large herds of the same animal. So the fact that we're bringing it's not just about, as you said, it's not just about these exotic contacts, but it's also about the fact that we are changing the nature of the normal relationships between ourselves and animals. It's, globalization, the Anthropocene, is not just about the destruction of biodiversity, although that obviously is a really important issue, but it's also about the fact we are supporting the proliferation of certain animal populations, rats around cities, urban foxes, particular domesticated animals. It's really interesting that there's no critical reflection upon that, and yet we're quite happy to point the finger at people over there who do weird things. I remember when I was at grad school, we had a Sri Lankan friend who was just horrified that her PhD supervisor allowed the dog in the kitchen. I mean, that was something that was just utterly taboo for her. So there's all sorts of things that I think, we see the world through our inherited lenses, and I think the geographical imagination is really important. And I was really hoping that we would have a shift towards a more collaborative geographical imagination that recognized our shared precarity, rather than this kind of geopolitical attempt to reimpose boundaries of otherness.
I think that's given us a lot of food for thought. And I think a lot of what we've talked about today has given us a lot of things to kind of go and reflect upon. I think just to wrap up, my final thing to you, it can be as short an answer, as long an answer as you would like. But if you could speak directly to the people listening today and give them one takeaway, if they're thinking, oh, well, what can I do to help shift these narratives that are happening? What would you say to them to kind of take away?
That's an enormous question.
It's a tricky one. I've had one-line answers. I've had multiple paragraph answers.
Okay, the takeaway for this is that we need to take environmental change much more seriously. There's a sense that COVID has come along and has become more important than environmental change, climate change, whatever you want to call it, and that we've taken our eye off the ball. One of the things that COVID has shown us is that certain things we have been told are inevitable, it's just the way the world is, are in fact political choices. It has shown us, albeit under very unusual conditions, that we can live in different ways. And I think the very early weeks of lockdown, people began to understand what mattered to them a bit more. It seems a bit trite, but people could hear birdsong in the city. People were enjoying time to see family, to walk about the place. The government has suddenly discovered it can be quite socialist and so forth. I would like this experience to make people a little bit braver about challenging what we are told is the norm and think that we can do things differently. And I think it has to be around the environment because, as I said in your answer to the last question, this will not be the last pandemic. There's evidence to show that zoonotic diseases are something like 70 or 80% of the diseases that humans face, and the spillovers are becoming more frequent. And we have set up an ideal situation for a pathogen to get around the world in 24 hours and spread amongst us very, very quickly. If we don't do something, this will just have been a dress rehearsal. So that sounds a bit melodramatic as a line to spin.
I quite like a little bit of melodrama can go a long way, I think. Well, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks very much. It's been really interesting.
Welcome back. For our penultimate episode, this idea of keeping focused seems exceptionally fitting, as it is only as we get towards the end we realise the scale of the issues facing pangolin, and the ways that each of us can contribute to their protection. What is also important to recognise is that Joe talked a lot about contextualisation while critiquing the One Health initiative, as it is only when we recognise the issues facing particular areas and people we can deal with them effectively. In this theme, in the final episode of our series, we will be talking to Penelope Jacobs about her experiences living within Southeast Asia. She will be sharing her lived experiences and talking about how the coronavirus pandemic and the perception of the pangolin is shaped within these regions. Additionally, we will recap some of the most poignant and important moments from the series to make sure that we all know what we can do to help prevent the plight of the pangolin. All that remains for this episode, however, is to conclude. And so, until next time, thank you once again to Joe, and thank you very much for listening.